Everyone has heard that it's important to read to children from a very early age. But do you know why it's important? What are the benefits of reading aloud to children, and what can the reader do to maximize those benefits from those reading experiences? Stick around. We'll explore these important questions in this episode of Never Stop Learning. Before we get into those benefits, tips, and tricks of reading out loud to children, I want to invite you to subscribe. Please press the little subscribe button below and the notification bell so that you can get notified each time we upload a new lesson to Never Stop Learning. Let's look at the first benefit of reading aloud to children, and that is their development of thinking about stories. The oral tradition was the ancient practice of storytelling. Every culture throughout time has practiced this tradition. Long before books and movies, story was necessarily the dominant mode of teaching, entertainment, and remembering. Among today's storytellers are our authors, cinematographers, podcasters, and even YouTube creators. They are the ones who today explain, entertain, and record information. When they are read to, children develop a sense of story from the books that are read to them. Consequently, they'll subconsciously begin to develop a schema or a type of unwritten outline in their heads for each type of story that they're read. Both nonfiction and fiction stories have archetypal or typical patterns. Nonfiction stories present information organized by cause and effect, problem and solution, chronology, factual listing, and comparison and contrast. Fiction stories follow various types of plots depending upon the genre. When children begin to internalize the differences between types of text structures as a result of being read to, they can begin to make predictions about text, and they're well on their way to developing metacognitive skills. Those are skills which involve thinking about your own thinking about some topic or task, and that's going to serve as a basis for their reading development in much the same way that all consumers of storytelling have learned from stories over thousands of years. That learning from stories is comprehension. You have no doubt heard that children who are not ready to begin school possess significantly smaller vocabularies than children who are considered to be ready for school. There are some notable studies out there that point out the importance of children developing a wide vocabulary, and I will link to that information in the description below so you can check that information out yourself. Why does vocabulary development matter? How does the number of words a child can understand and use in spoken language correlate to success in reading development? Think about it. Isn't it easier for you to figure out a new word in print if you've heard the word before and you have some inkling of its meaning, rather than trying to figure out a word that you've never heard before? For developing readers, having a relatively large speaking and listening vocabulary scaffolds and simplifies the process and much of the work of reading. For developing readers, having a relatively large speaking and listening vocabulary scaffolds and simplifies the process and much of the work of reading. When they come across a new word in text, once they've sounded out and connected the new word to the one they already possess in their speaking listening vocabulary, for which they already have an idea about the meaning as well, they can proceed on with the text, on with the story. In fact, students often won't have to sound out the entire word. They can use context and maybe just initial sounds to figure out which of the words that they already have in their head would work in this instance and make sense. The stronger their speaking and listening vocabulary, the more likely it will be that they can use context and recognition of beginning sounds and word chunks to dive into the treasure chest of vocabulary words in their head and pull out the new word. On the other hand, students who have limited speaking listening vocabularies may struggle for the meaning of a word even after they've used their decoding skills to be able to say the word, increasing the time they have to spend identifying the new word and limiting their ability to comprehend the text that they're reading. Over time, these impediments compound, and they'll severely limit the child's reading development, especially in terms of reading fluency, independence, and confidence. Now, you may be thinking that you have to get started right away teaching intense vocabulary lessons to your preschooler, but that is not the case. If you read to your child on a regular basis and often use natural opportunities to teach your child new words in authentic contexts. Let's get to the tips and tricks of reading aloud. I'm going to do a read aloud here with you in just a few minutes, and as I do this read aloud, magically beside me will appear the tips and tricks and strategies for doing an effective read aloud with children. Now, I want to caution you even before we get started, don't get so hung up in the teaching part of the read aloud that the enjoyment of the story gets lost. That's really easy to do. Just consider that over time, you will probably hit a lot of these points over and over again. There's no need to hit each one of these tips, tricks, and strategies in one read aloud. The book I'm going to share with you today from is Old Yeller, and it is a classic, one probably you're familiar with. You'll notice in looking at it, I have a number on here, and this is actually the Lexile number for this particular book, 910, which means it's about 8th or 9th grade reading level. If you want to check the reading level of a book, you can go to Lexile.com and just type in the author's name or the title, and it'll give you an approximate reading level for that book. Based mostly on sentence structure and vocabulary, not really based on the maturity that it would need to that a student would need to understand that particular topic. I just want to put that little caveat in there for you. It is based on the technicalities of a book, not so much on the story itself and the amount of maturity it would take to understand and appreciate that particular story. So back to Old Yeller. I'm going to probably be reading this to a 4th or 5th grade type audience or student. I could sit side by side with the child if the child were here with me, but in this case, I'm going to pretend like I'm reading to you. You can see here, this book is by Fred Gibson, and there is a drawn illustration inside the front cover. So we can tell right away that this is a story about a dog named Old Yeller. Chapter 1. We called him Old Yeller. The name had sort of a double meaning. One part meant that his short hair was a dingy yellow color that we called yeller in those days. The other meant that when he opened his head, the sound he let out came closer to being a yell than a bark. So right away, we can tell that this is being told from a first-person point of view. The narrator actually is a character in the story. And he goes on to say, I remember like yesterday how he strayed out in the middle of nowhere to our log cabin on Birdsong Creek. He made me so mad at first that I wanted to kill him, and later, when I had to kill him, it was like having to shoot some of my own folks. That's how much I'd come to think of the big yeller dog. Whoa. This author comes out, this narrator comes out and tells us in the very beginning of this book, eventually, he's going to have to shoot this dog. That's quite a revelation. A lot of times in stories, we have to work up to the climax of the story very slowly, getting lots of details. But in this story, wow, the narrator, the author just comes right out and tells you what's going to happen. So what do we need to find out? We need to find out why this is going to happen. We know it's going to happen, but we need to find out why. So we'll have to watch the plot very carefully and see how it unfolds. He came in the late 1860s, the best I remember. So we now have his setting. Anyhow, it was that year that Papa had a bunch of other Salt Lick settlers formed a pool herd of their little separate bunches of steers and trailed them to the new cattle market in Abilene, Kansas. This was a way to get cash money, a thing that all Texans were short of in those years right after the Civil War. We lived then in a new country, and a good one. As Papa pointed out, the day the men talked over making the drive, we had wild game for the killing, fertile ground for growing bread corn, and the Indians had been put to reservations with the return of U.S. soldiers to the Texas forts. In fact, Papa wound up, all we lack having a tight tailbolt on the world is a little cash money, and we can get that at Abilene. Well, the idea sounded good, but some of the men still hesitated. Abilene was better than 600 miles north of Texas hill country that we lived in. It would take months for all the men to drive and ride back home. And all the time, the women folks and children of Salt Licks would be left in a wild frontier settlement to make out as best they could. So let's think about what the family was like here. It said life was good, except they just didn't have any cash money. So their lives are stable, but they have to work hard to get this cash money, and they're going to have to leave their families behind in order to do it. I'm wondering, how long is this going to take? And what are some of the sacrifices that this family is going to have to make? Still, they needed money, and they realized that whatever a man does, he's bound to take some risks. So they talked it over with each other and with their women and decided it was a thing to do. They told their folks what to do in case the Indians came off the reservation, or the coons got to eating the corn, or the bears got to killing too many hogs. They gathered the cattle, burned a trail brand on their hips, and pulled out on the long trail to Kansas. I wonder how far it is in miles from Texas to Kansas. I'll have to look that up sometime. Did it say already? Oh, better than 600 miles north. Okay, well, we'll leave that. I remember how it was the day Papa left. I remember his standing in front of the cabin with his horse saddled, his bedroll tied on the back of the cantle. I remember how tall and straight and handsome he looked, with his high-crowned hat and his black mustaches drooping in cow-horn curves past the corners of his mouth. Wow, there's a lot of imagery in this particular section of the text. And his bedroll tied onto the back of the cantle, C-A-N-T-L-E. We're going to have to figure out what those words mean. I remember how Mama was trying to keep from crying because he was leaving, and how little Arliss, who was only 5 and didn't know much, was trying to keep from crying at all. In fact, he was howling his head off. And not because Papa was leaving, but because he couldn't go too. If you ever really wanted to go with someone somewhere, you feel pretty left out, don't you? I think this is how little Arliss was feeling, left out and unappreciated. Well, the narrator goes on to say, I wasn't about to cry. I was 14 years old, pretty near a grown man. I stood back and didn't let on for a minute that I wanted to cry. So the author is telling us something about himself here. He's admitting that he's having these feelings too. Papa got through loving up Mama and little Arliss and mounted his horse. I looked up at him. He motioned for me to come along, so I walked beside his horse, down the trail that led under the big live oaks and past the spring. When he'd gotten out of the hearing of the house, Papa reached down and put his hand on my shoulder. Now, Travis, he said, you're getting to be a big boy. While I'm gone, you'll be the man of the family. I want you to act like one. You take care of Mama and little Arliss. You look after the work and don't wait around for your Mama to point out what needs to be done. Do you think you can do that? Yes, sir, I said. Now, there's the cows to milk and the wood to cut and the young pigs to mark, the fresh meat to shoot, but mainly there's the corn patch. If you don't work it right, or if you let the varmints eat up the roasting ears, we'll be without bread corn for the winter. Yes, sir, I said. All right, son. I'll be seeing you this fall. I stood there and let him ride on. There wasn't any more to say. Suddenly I remembered and went running down the trail after him, calling for him to wait. He pulled up his horse and twisted around in the saddle. Yeah, boy, he said, what is it? That horse, I said. What horse? He said like he'd never heard me mention it before. Now, Papa, I complained. You know I've been aching all over for a horse to ride. I've told you time and again. I looked up to catch him grinning at me and felt foolish that I hadn't realized he was teasing. What you're needing worse than a horse is a good dog. Yes, sir, I said, but a horse is what I'm wanting the worst. All right, he said. You act a man's part while I'm gone, and I'll see that you get a man's horse to ride when I sell the cattle. I think we can shake on that deal. He reached out his hand and we shook. It was the first time I'd ever shaken hands like a man. It made me feel big and solemn and important in a way I'd never felt before.